in my role at Citizen Potawatomi Nation, I'm responsible for, like many tribes, we are the recruiters, we are the approvers, the writers of the home study, the trainers, all of that. So my tribe is no different. So as a part of the approval process is a home study, which I think most people that would be listening to this know what a home study is. But it's an assessment of applicants to see if they are fit and capable to care for children here in foster care, or to adopt them. And so I hear a lot of people describe it as a biography. I definitely don't look at it that way. I look at it as an assessment. A biography means we're just taking information and just approving them. But with an assessment, we are looking in like a 360 view to make sure that these people are appropriate and stable. So as a part of that, in addition to all of the like application paperwork and background checks, for the home study, I take this form here, I call it my home study questionnaire, and that is what I take to the home. I do at least 3 home visits. So what I normally do is, if it's a married couple, my first visit is interviewing them together as a couple, going through their relationship, their motivation and purpose, and why they want to foster or adopt. And then my second visit is their individual interviews. And then if they have children, I have to interview children. So if they're not verbal, I just make observations and write that up. But if they can talk to me at all, I talk to them, I ask them questions, and like in a private setting. So typically it's 3 home visits. Sometimes it could be 4. And there's been times I've only done 2 because if they're single, don't have any children, so it's a little more difficult to squeeze in a 3rd visit, but we just kind of play it by ear. So whenever I go to the home, I start with the questionnaire. So this questionnaire is not necessarily it's in the format of how the home study is written and not in the format of how I interview necessarily. So kind of skip around. So on page 1, this is really where I start. This is the first thing I talk to the foster parents about together as a couple, is what is their purpose and motivation. So I ask them, why do you want to become a foster home? What qualities do you have that would make you a good foster home? And just kind of go with that. I always ask if there's any fertility issues, even if they don't mention it. That's something I want to know, because people with fertility issues sometimes can have, emotional connection to fostering and adoption deeper than someone that, as far as getting attached to children, because if they can't have children of their own, then, we need to make sure that they understand as a foster parent that child is not yours. You are a temporary caregiver until maybe adoption would occur, but it's not required. So this is really an important section for me, because I want to gauge, are they wanting to help a child, or are they wanting a child to help them? Because that's not what I'm looking for. I want them to be trying to fulfill a child's life. So I also asked them, do they know about the child welfare system? What kind of child did they feel it would best fit in their home? And so this is like placement preferences. And the reason this is important is so that that they have the right expectations. Because if they tell you, well, yeah, I'll be a foster parent, but I only want a newborn, and I want them to be open for adoption, and I want them to be blonde and Christian, or whatever it might be. If they have expectations that aren't realistic, then this is an important time in the beginning of your visits for them to be able to, you have the opportunity to teach them and educate them. And so then I talk to them about, are you okay with DHS or tribal staff completing home visits in your home unannounced? So as you guys may know, in a lot of foster parent trainings, they don't really talk so much about like what it's like the day-to-day to be a foster parent. A lot of the curriculums just focus on trauma, behavior, having a strong family. So I also look at the home study as a time that I'm educating them on like what the court system looks like. I'm educating them. I talk to them about WIC and daycare assistance and things like that. So then when I do individual interviews, it is, so like, for example, if I was interviewing the foster mother applicant, I talk about the family makeup so that I can kind of see, because some people have blended families. And so I want to know from the beginning, when I start asking them about their childhood, what may I need to ask? It's really important to ask them about the highlights, but also if there was any trauma that they faced as a child. And I'll tell you something, if you don't ask them, they might not tell you because they don't know. Like, as a foster parent, they're not an expert on knowing what they need to tell us for our assessment, but we're the expert on knowing what to ask them. So I even ask if their parents were ever separated. And then we go through and talk about developmental needs, what was discipline like in the home, what are their thoughts about the discipline. We go over their school years, all the schools that they went to, any college education. And then, so this part, describe any significant life experiences you've faced in your life, positive or negative. This is when I want to hear about like what has really impacted them. So it could be, the positives could be a marriage, a birth, maybe they took a trip around the world that taught them about life, or it could be a negative. So maybe something that's impacted them is the loss of a child or a parent. It could be a divorce, just things like that. Like how has it impacted them? And then what have they learned from it? And if it was negative, how have they healed from it? And then we want to hear about their interests, hobbies, their personality, and then of course any past marriages. But also something to think about is not everyone gets married. So it says married here, but really it's long-term relationships too. So any significant romantic relationships they've had. So then the foster father, that information repeats. And again, I do those things individually. They do get to see what each other said. And I told them that from the beginning, but it's just more comfortable if we can have one-on-one time. So then we talk about their relationship, struggles they have in their marriage, how they overcome their struggles. I asked them to tell me about the worst argument they've ever had. And so that's always kind of interesting. One of my recent applicants, she said the worst one they had was when they were planning their wedding. And she said that she wanted a classy wedding, and he said they weren't classy. So sometimes those are humorous, but I mean, to her it was a big deal, but to me it's funny afterwards. And then sometimes it has to do with finances. And if that's the case, then I'm like, okay, now I know I need to talk more about finances with them and make sure there's stability there. And I do talk about that too. If they've ever filed for bankruptcy, who handles the bills? Like how do they handle their money? It's also important to go over relationship with extended family because, for example, explain any criminal history. If we don't ask, they may not tell us. And what if their parent is a convicted sex offender or domestic violence abuser, and then they want to use them as like their unofficial alternate caregiver, or that person's going to be coming over. So those are important things to ask about too. And then we go, same thing with the father, then we ask about siblings, and they're pretty similar questions to the parents. And so I have a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of pages, but if you have ever done a home study, you know that it's a lot of writing and you need a lot of room to be able to fill out these things. Then home environment is the next section. So I asked them like what their routines are like. I want to know if a child was going into their home, what would we expect for that child? The school district and daycare plan, you have to make sure to ask them about their daycare plan because some people really don't think about it. And if in Oklahoma, we have a lot of rural foster parents, like I'm from a town of about 150 people, there's obviously not a daycare there. So I would want to know like if that's where they live, do they plan on taking the child to the town where they work? Because I promise you, some people just don't think about it. Then we do ask about their adult children. This is really important. Then children in the home. And we do, like I said, interview all of anyone in the home gets an individual interview, but we also ask the parents, the future foster parents, these questions too. I want to hear their thoughts about their child. And as far as references go, I do call all the adult children, even if they are the parent who is on the child welfare case. Don't always successfully reach them. If they're in prison, typically we just bypass it, but it just kind of depends. Then we talk about spiritual beliefs. This is extremely important because they may have a certain belief that would not, maybe be the best fit for a certain child. Sorry, I scrolled down. So we need to know like what is their involvement in religion, if any. Okay, then talk about culture. This is also important. So what is their knowledge of involvement in Potawatomi or Native American culture? How will they connect a child? And then we ask them, would they be willing to do some things that we request, like attend our festival and visit our museum? And it's it's also important to ask about culture because there are some ceremonies that may children may see things that would alarm a parent if they told them about, like maybe a piercing ceremony in a Sundance or something like that, or seeing people smoke tobacco out of a pipe when maybe drugs were an issue that the child had witnessed before. So we want to make sure that we have all of that listed of what are their ceremonies like if they're involved at all. And then
Kendra,
yes,
Kendra, this is Esther. Do you require foster parents to have a cultural contract saying what they will, agree to do for each particular child?
yeah, we don't. But the thing is, so I only when I came here, there were 2 foster homes. So that was about 2 years ago. I worked at a different tribe for about 7 years, and so I actually one-on-one know the foster parents. Like we only have 2 case managers, so we actually have this natural ability to keep in contact. We keep them culturally connected. Whenever they get placement of a child, we send an entire cultural packet. I send a monthly newsletter with cultural information, and then, like I said, most of our homes are in this area, and they are all willing to come to our festival, which had to be canceled this year. But so far, it's worked out pretty good. But I do think that would be a good idea to think about.
Thank you.
So then continuing on is the health section. So we list in their medications and diagnoses. Anytime someone has a health condition that is outside of something standard, so maybe if they have anxiety and depression, then I want to know, okay, like what, why do you feel like you have that? Was that onset from an incident? Is it something you've dealt with your entire life? How does medication make you feel? And I always get the dosages to everything too, and I look it up to kind of see and compare. I've reached out to medical professionals before to ask about certain medications and how they interact with each other. So that's important to think about as well. Um, Tobacco use, alcohol use, and then we go over the mental health area. So this is asking them if they've ever been a victim, because if they have, we need to know that because they could get an emotional trigger based off a child they get placed with, and we need to prepare and make sure that we're placing the right children with that home for what needs they can meet. And then go over their finances. So, of course, their job and what they like and dislike about their job. And then if they've had any criminal or child welfare involvement with them or their family. So for references, I do check 6 references, 3 family, 3 friends, and then if they have adult children. I don't personally do a school reference or an employer reference at this time, but I know some tribes do. And so that's something to think about. And then, of course, a mental health reference could be required in some instances. And then we talk more about their thoughts on discipline and how they will handle, having a foster child in their home. So this is an example of the home study. So this is I have made up names and made up information throughout it, so don't worry. But so section 1 is identifying information. I put my contacts down with them. So then I summarize everything that they've said. So this talks about why they want to foster, why Peter and McKenna Peter and Lily want to foster. And then when I talked about the childhood section, that's throughout here. Sometimes it can be really lengthy. I just did kind of a simple one where there wasn't a lot of childhood trauma or parental separation, just to kind of make it shorter and easier to read. But like the discipline section, that could be extensive. If the discipline was abusive, then that might be something that you have more to write about. Their education, interests and personalities, and the life experiences. Again, some people's are very long, like a whole page. Sometimes it's just a little more simple. And I will say, I work with foster parents that really have a peachy keen life. Like they had good parents and a good childhood and just not a lot of negatives. So, I think that's a good thing. But I have to make sure and dig deep to make sure they're not just skipping through the hard stuff so they don't have to talk about it. And then I would write about their previous marriages or relationships. And then the foster mother's information repeats, the relationship, extended family, home environment. So as you can see, I write a pretty detailed summary of what the home looks like. So I want someone to be able to read it and kind of see in their head what this property and what this house is like. Children in the home, this is where I interviewed them about their children, and I would put this in this section. I list out the schools and vehicles and child care plan. This is where I talk about culture, family support, and their spiritual support and religious beliefs. This is where I put health. So section 8 was health. Section 9 is finances. So 10, 11, and 12, we consider confidential that we keep that confidential from the applicants. So they don't see a summary of their background checks, references, or what their children said in their private interviews. And so whenever foster parents, they do get to review all of their home study except those attachments. And so discipline and confidentiality, we put some policy statements in there. They do sign policy agreements during the process too. And then this is where I do my observation and recommendation. Normally it's longer, but this is my example. So I just talk about what are their strengths. And if I have concerns, for sure I'd list them there, especially if you're recommending denial of the home study, which could happen. You could get so far into it that, and then discover something later on that's a concern and may need to, recommend denial. So I've had to do that multiple times, sometimes with relative applications. So then we have them sign and date that they reviewed it. And so my attachments look like this. So my background checks, I have it spelled out. And this is important to do clearly because a lot of times the judges are reading these and attorneys are reading these whenever adoptions occur. So I want to be very clear that if they have any criminal history or anything on their record that could be brought up during their adoption or during that process, that I have clearly spelled it all out.
Kendra, this
yes.
is Esther again. Are there tribal court systems that you also need to do record checks from in tribal?
Yes. Well, NACSA requires that, Native American Children's Safety Act of 2016. Mm-hmm. So we do, it's not, they haven't rolled out like that we have to start doing it yet, but we are able to check within our own court system at this time. But eventually, technically it's already law, but we will have to contact. So the practice is anywhere the applicant has lived within 5 years, whatever tribes have jurisdiction over that city, we have to check. So Shawnee, where I am, for example, has about 4 or 5 tribes that have jurisdiction in Shawnee. So if I have a family that lives here, I will be contacting for criminal records and for child welfare history, all 5 of those tribes. And then if they lived, say they lived in Miami, Oklahoma, it looks like Miami, we say Miami. There's 5 or 6 tribes there. We would have to check those as well. So that is what the law requires.
It seems like a good process of communication would be smart,
And so far there hasn't really been, I have developed a form and like we have a system here, but I know some tribes haven't really begun to think about it yet. But just something important to know is like tribes are required to do this, but states are not. States are not required. The state of Oklahoma is not required to contact us to run child welfare records on foster care applicants, on parents, anything. So that is kind of like unique. So, and you guys may know in your areas that there's that stereotype of it's easier to get approved through the tribe and their home studies are not as good. But, I think that kind of helps prove that wrong is we were actually required to check a lot more than the state is. So like I said, I just spell out anything. So we search, so this doesn't have the tribal stuff listed. I'll be adding it as soon as we roll out, like we have to start doing it. And so OSBI is our Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. So their criminal name search, their fingerprints, the sex offender registry, all of that is ran together. Even their traffic records, I don't have that listed on here for some reason. Oh yeah, I do. Okay, so but we search the Department of Corrections under any alias they've had. There's 2 online criminal and court record systems in Oklahoma. And so we have to search both of those. And then like you see listed here, we do our own search internally for CPN is Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And then we have to do DHS too. And that would be with DHS, any state they've lived in within 5 years. So then attachment B, this is where the references are. So some tribes and some state agencies will list out every single thing each reference said. That's good, especially if, there's like 10 people reading home study. My director is the only one reading it here. And if we have questions about the references, we can go back through them. But I just usually take one quote from each one, and then as long as they're positive. When I have a negative reference, which I have, they get their own section. I'm like, all references are positive except one, and then I put all that information from that on there. And normally, I've had some people concerned about fitness of some relatives, but I've also had people, they're like, well, they homeschool and I don't agree with it. I'm like, okay, but do you have concerns about the homeschool? No, I just don't think it's good for kids. I'm like, okay. So you want to, like, if there's any negative comments, I always make sure and put those in there, because in case it comes in the future, another bad one comes in or a concern about that, we have addressed it already. And then attachment C is my interview. And so I have interview questions that I ask that kind of covers all different kinds of topics. And then I always sit in the room with the kid and usually ask if we can shut their door, if it's like a small house, and then play games, and I ask them all the questions and all of that. So it's that's, you know, so that is our home study. So typically they're up to about 20 pages long. And with the worker before me's were like 5 pages. So I have a little bit, it's a little bit more in depth. If you're just meeting the minimum requirements of the state, then you could actually, in Oklahoma, you could just do a few pages of a home study. But as you can tell, like, we want to make sure that this is a thorough assessment at our tribe.
Thank you, Kendra. Now, when you typically when you license foster homes, do they commit to being open, or because I know in some communities, folks are like, well, I'll only do it for somebody in my family.
Yeah,
I wouldn't take anybody else's kids.
Yeah, so they need to be willing to take strangers, children. So everything I talked about, I do with relatives too. So we don't have like, again, I'm the only worker that we have that does licensing. And so like, I have one relative foster home, and they're actually in Arkansas. So we have the ability to license homes out of state as well. I don't normally do it for foster care and adoption because our tribal members are spread all over the nation. And so we don't have one concentrated area where I need foster homes. It'd just be Oklahoma. But yeah, relatives have to go through the same process. And I also really don't license homes for adoption only, because what happens in the first phone call, I explain to them what adoption looks like in foster care. And it's not that you're going to adopt a baby after, you know, a few months. It's like whatsoever. And so usually people are like, okay, that's not for me. And so I just want people to understand the difference between foster care adoption and private adoption. And so all of my foster parents, most of them want to adopt. I have a couple that are foster only, but the ones that want to adopt are foster parents too. They're taking care of children. Some of them have had children who have gone to family or returned home. And, you know, they've signed on just like a foster parent would, like typically when you think about them.